In the heart of Wyoming's frozen wilderness, a solitary cowboy made a choice that defied all reason. When he found a dying wolf in the snow, every instinct told him to walk away. Wolves were the enemy killers of livestock, threats to his livelihood. But something in those fading golden eyes made him stop. What happened next would transform his isolated ranch into the center of an extraordinary mystery. By dawn, his world would change forever, surrounded by 300 wolves standing silent guard. This is a story about compassion, survival, and the unbreakable bonds that transcend species. The wind howled across the Montana border with a fury that could strip flesh from bone. Jack Morrison pulled his collar tighter around his weathered face as he guided his horse through the deepening snow. At 62, he'd seen countless winters in these mountains, but this one was proving to be particularly brutal. The January storm had been raging for 3 days, and Jack was making his final rounds before darkness fell completely, checking the fence lines of his 2,000-acre ranch that had been in his family for 4 generations. His mare, Sarah, suddenly stopped and refused to move forward, her ears pinned back in obvious distress. Jack had learned long ago to trust his horse's instincts. He dismounted carefully, his boots sinking into snow that reached his knees, and scanned the wide landscape. That's when he saw a dark shape partially buried in a drift near the tree line, about 50 yards away. As he approached cautiously, his heart sank. It was a wolf, and from the looks of it, the animal was dying. Jack's jaw tightened. Wolves had been the bane of his existence for decades. Just last spring, a pack had taken down 3 of his calves, costing him thousands of dollars. His neighbors had lost even more. The ranching community saw wolves as nothing but trouble, especially since their reintroduction to the region had caused ongoing conflicts between conservationists and those trying to make a living off the land. Every rancher Jack knew would have left this wolf to die, or worse, would have put it out of its misery with a single shot. But as Jack stood over the fallen animal, something stopped him. The wolf was massive, easily weighing over 100 pounds, with fur that mixed silver, black, and white in a pattern he'd never seen before. Its breathing was shallow, labored, and a deep gash across its flank suggested it had been in a terrible fight. The animal's eyes, a striking amber gold, opened slowly and fixed on Jack's face. There was no aggression there, no threat, only exhaustion and something that looked almost like resignation, as if the wolf understood its time had come. Jack knelt down in the snow, his practical mind warring with something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. He'd spent his entire life reading animals, understanding their behavior, respecting their place in the natural order, even when they conflicted with his livelihood. This wolf was different somehow. He could see scars across its body, evidence of a long, hard life as what he suspected was an alpha. The wounds were fresh, still bleeding into the pristine snow, creating dark flowers of crimson that spread slowly outward. Making a decision that he knew his neighbors would call foolish, Jack removed his heavy coat and carefully wrapped it around the wolf. The animal was too weak to resist, managing only a soft whine as Jack lifted it with a grunt of effort. The wolf was heavier than he'd anticipated, but Jack had spent a lifetime working with livestock, and his strength, though diminished by age, was still considerable. He carried the wolf to his horse, and after several attempts and some creative problem-solving, managed to secure the animal across Sarah's back. The ride back to the ranch house took nearly an hour through the worsening storm. Jack led Sarah on foot, one hand on the reins, the other steadying the wolf. He talked to both animals as they walked, his voice nearly lost in the wind, saying things he'd never admit to saying in daylight. He told them about his late wife, Margaret, who had died 5 years ago and had always had a soft spot for wild things. She used to leave food out for foxes and coyotes, much to Jack's grumbling disapproval. Now here he was, risking frostbite to save a creature that represented everything threatening to his way of life. When they finally reached the barn, Jack's hands were numb, and his face was raw from the cold. He carried the wolf into an empty stall he'd prepared for a mare that was due to foal in the spring. The space was clean, filled with fresh hay, and most importantly, it was warm. Jack laid the wolf down gently and began examining its wounds more carefully under the lantern light. The gash on its flank was deep but clean, likely from another wolf's claws. There were puncture wounds on its neck and shoulders, and one of its hind legs was swollen, possibly broken. Jack had doctored countless animals over the years, though never a wolf. He worked through the night, cleaning wounds, applying antibiotics he kept for his cattle, and fashioning a splint for the leg. The wolf remained conscious but docile throughout, those golden eyes following Jack's every movement. It was as if the animal understood that Jack was trying to help, that this human was different from any it had encountered before. When Jack finally finished, exhausted and covered in blood and mud, he brought the wolf water in a bucket and some raw meat from his freezer. The wolf drank deeply, but left the meat untouched. Jack sat on a hay bale, watching the animal's labored breathing begin to steady. He knew he should be afraid. He knew he should have let nature take its course. But something about this night felt significant in a way he couldn't articulate. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside this small circle of lamplight, a cowboy and a wolf existed in an impossible moment of peace. Jack didn't sleep that night. He kept vigil, checking on the wolf every hour, adjusting its position, ensuring it stayed warm. And as dawn approached, something extraordinary began to happen. The first hints of daylight were just touching the horizon when Jack heard them. It started as a single howl, distant and mournful, cutting through the dying wind. Then another joined it, and another, until the air was filled with a chorus of wolf songs that raised the hair on the back of Jack's neck. He'd heard wolves howl before, but never like this, never so many, never so close, and never with such intensity. It sounded like grief, like a requiem for the fallen. Jack moved to the barn door and eased it open, stepping out into the pre-dawn darkness. What he saw froze him in place. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow that glowed in the faint light. And there, surrounding his ranch house and barn in a massive circle, were wolves. Dozens of them. No, more than dozens. As Jack's eyes adjusted and his mind tried to process what he was seeing, he realized there had to be at least 100 wolves arranged in concentric rings around his property. They weren't attacking or advancing. They simply sat in the snow, silent now after their haunting chorus, all facing toward the barn where their fallen packmate lay. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd never heard of wolf behavior like this. Wolves traveled in packs of 6 to 10 members, sometimes as many as 15 in rare cases. But this was impossible. It was as if every wolf pack in the mountain range had converged on his ranch overnight. Jack's rational mind searched for explanations. Perhaps they'd followed the blood scent. Maybe they were waiting to reclaim their pack member, whether alive or dead. But something about the scene felt different, almost ceremonial. The wolves made no aggressive movements, showed no signs of agitation. They simply waited with an eerie patience that seemed almost human in its purposefulness. Retreating to the barn, Jack checked on his patient. The wolf was awake now, its head lifted, ears pointed toward the door. It let out a low, rumbling call, not aggressive, but something else. A communication. And outside, the assembled wolves responded with a series of short barks and howls that sounded to Jack's inexperienced ears almost like acknowledgement or respect. As full dawn broke, Jack could see the gathering more clearly, and his earlier estimate proved conservative. There weren't 100 wolves surrounding his property. There were hundreds. The rising sun illuminated a sight that defied everything Jack understood about wolf behavior and biology. Every nearby fence post, every small rise in the land, every tree at the edge of his property held at least one wolf. Some were large males, their thick coats making them look massive in the early light. Others were smaller females, and Jack could even see some juveniles among the crowd. Jack's phone, which he'd forgotten about during his night-long vigil, suddenly buzzed to life with a series of missed calls and text messages. His neighbors had seen the wolves. The entire valley had seen them. Reports were coming in from ranches 5 miles in every direction. Wolves were moving through the area in unprecedented numbers, all heading toward Jack Morrison's property. The sheriff's department had been called. Wildlife officials were being contacted. People were terrified, locking themselves in their homes, convinced that some kind of super PAC was forming for reasons no one could explain. Jack's phone rang. It was Tom Fletcher, his nearest neighbor, whose property adjoined Jack's on the eastern border. Tom's voice was tight with fear and anger. "Jack, what the hell is happening? There's got to be 200 wolves between my place and yours. They're not attacking anything, just moving past like they're on a mission. My dogs are going crazy. My cattle are panicked. What's going on?" Jack didn't know how to answer. How could he explain what he'd done? How could he tell Tom, who'd lost a dozen cattle to wolves over the years, that he'd rescued one of the predators and brought it to his barn? "Stay inside, Tom," Jack said finally. "Keep your family safe. I don't think they're here to attack, but don't take chances. I'm calling the wildlife office now." But before Jack could make that call, he heard vehicles approaching. Within minutes, his driveway was filled with trucks. The sheriff arrived first, followed quickly by 2 rangers from the Department of Wildlife. Behind them came neighbors Tom Fletcher, the Hartley family, old Jim Dawson, and at least a dozen others. They all stood at a careful distance from the barn, staring in disbelief at the sea of wolves surrounding the property. Sheriff Bob Hutchins, who'd known Jack for 40 years, approached cautiously. "Jack, I need you to tell me what's happening here. We've got a situation that's beyond anything I've ever seen. Every wolf in a 100-mile radius seems to be converging on your ranch. Some folks are talking about grabbing rifles and handling this themselves. I need information, and I need it now." Jack took a deep breath and made a decision. He told him about finding the wolf, about bringing it back to the barn, about treating its wounds. The response was immediate and explosive. Tom Fletcher's face turned red with anger. "You did what? Jack, have you lost your mind? You brought a wolf onto your property? After everything they've cost us?" One of the wildlife rangers, a young woman named Sarah Chun, pushed forward. "Mr. Morrison, can I see the animal?" Her voice was calmer than the others, marked by scientific curiosity rather than anger. Jack led her into the barn, and she knelt beside the injured wolf, examining it carefully while maintaining a respectful distance. After several minutes, she returned to the group outside, her face pale with amazement. "That's not just any wolf," she said quietly. "That's an alpha, and an old one. Look at the scars, the size, the coloring. I'd guess it's at least 12 years old, maybe older. And given the response we're seeing," she gestured at the hundreds of wolves surrounding the property, "this isn't just an alpha of one pack. This animal is something I've never seen documented. It's possible this wolf is what we might call a super alpha, a wolf that commands respect across multiple pack territories." The explanation hung in the air as everyone processed it. The young ranger continued, "Wolves have complex social structures, but we've never observed anything on this scale. If my theory is correct, this wolf has lived long enough and established enough dominance that it is recognized by wolves across an enormous territory. By saving its life, Mr. Morrison, you may have done something that is being recognized by the entire wolf population of this mountain range." As Sarah spoke, more wolves continued to arrive, filtering in from the surrounding forest like gray ghosts materializing from the morning mist. By 9 o'clock, with the sun fully risen, Jack's ranch had become the center of an unprecedented natural phenomenon. And in his barn, The old alpha wolf continued to rest, its golden eyes alert and watching, as if it too understood that something extraordinary was unfolding. By midday, the situation had escalated beyond anything the local authorities could handle. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing footage that would soon dominate national news broadcasts. Wolf experts from universities across the country were making emergency travel arrangements to reach the remote Wyoming Valley. The governor's office had called 3 times. And still the wolves came, their numbers swelling to proportions that seemed impossible. Sarah Chun, the wildlife ranger, had set up a makeshift observation post in Jack's living room, conducting counts and documenting behavior patterns with growing amazement. "We're at 287 confirmed individuals," she reported to her colleagues via satellite phone. "And that's a conservative estimate. Some are bedded down in the forest beyond clear visibility. The true number could be over 300. Inside the barn, Jack sat beside the injured wolf, which had finally eaten some of the meat he'd provided. The animal's breathing was stronger now, its eyes brighter. Jack had checked its wounds and changed the bandages, working with a gentleness that surprised him. The wolf tolerated his ministrations with remarkable patience, occasionally lifting its head to look toward the door, as if sensing the massive gathering outside. "What are you?" Jack whispered, running his hand carefully along the wolf's uninjured side. "What kind of life have you lived to command this kind of loyalty?" As if in answer, the wolf shifted its position, and Jack noticed something he'd missed during his initial examination. Hidden beneath the thick fur of the wolf's neck was an old scar, a pattern that looked almost deliberate. Jack carefully parted the fur for a closer look and felt his breath catch. The scar was in the shape of a crude number, a brand or marking of some kind, though heavily healed and distorted by time and the animal's growth. Sarah Chun entered the barn at that moment, and Jack showed her his discovery. Her eyes widened as she examined the mark. This wolf was tagged or marked at some point, probably years ago when it was younger. We might be able to trace this back through our databases, see if it was part of any research or relocation program. She took several photographs with her camera, capturing the mark from multiple angles. Within 2 hours, Sarah had an answer that changed everything. The mark matched records from a wolf reintroduction program that had taken place 17 years earlier. The wolf had been part of a family group relocated from Canada to help restore the Wyoming wolf population. 17 years, Sarah breathed. That's ancient for a wild wolf. The average lifespan is 6 to 8 years in the wild. This animal has lived more than twice that long, survived countless challenges, established dominance over what must be an unprecedented territory, and fathered or mothered generations of offspring. Every wolf out there probably carries its genetic legacy. The revelation spread quickly through the assembled crowd of ranchers, officials, and media personnel. Opinions began to shift, though not uniformly. Some saw the wolf as a symbol of successful conservation, proof that reintroduction programs could work beyond expectations. Others saw it as confirmation of their worst fears, that wolf populations were growing too large, becoming too successful at the expense of ranching communities. But then something unexpected happened that afternoon, something that would turn public opinion in a direction no one anticipated. A young reporter named Michael Torres, who'd been documenting the scene for a Denver news station, noticed unusual activity among the wolves. They were moving, but not retreating. Instead, they were arranging themselves in what appeared to be a protective formation, with the largest males forming an outer ring, while females and younger wolves moved toward the interior of the circle. "What are they doing?" Michael asked Sarah, his camera still rolling. Sarah watched through binoculars, her professional demeanor cracking slightly to reveal genuine wonder. "They're establishing a defensive perimeter, but defending against what? There's no threat here except—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening. Oh my God. She'd seen it just as Jack emerged from the barn. A pair of mountain lions, likely drawn by the unusual animal activity, had appeared on the ridge overlooking the ranch. Mountain lions and wolves were natural competitors, though they usually avoided direct confrontation. But these cats, probably a mated pair judging by their size difference, seemed curious or perhaps territorial about the massive wolf gathering. What happened next was captured on camera and would be replayed millions of times across news channels and social media. As the mountain lions began to descend the ridge, moving with the fluid confidence of apex predators, the wolves responded with coordinated precision that spoke of a collective intelligence. They didn't attack or chase the cats. Instead, they created a living barrier, a wall of fur and teeth that stretched across the entire approach to Jack's ranch buildings. The message was clear and unmistakable. The ranch and the human who'd saved their alpha was under their protection. The mountain lions, no matter how powerful individually, weren't foolish enough to challenge 300 wolves. They retreated back up the ridge and disappeared into the forest. The wolves held their positions for another hour before gradually, almost reluctantly, returning to their waiting vigil. Sheriff Hutchins, who'd been watching the entire display, walked over to where Jack stood. In 40 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like that. They're not just here for their alpha, Jack. They're protecting you. Protecting your property. Jack nodded slowly, unable to find words for what he was feeling. He'd spent his entire life viewing wolves as adversaries, as threats to his livelihood and way of life. In a single night and day, that understanding had been shattered and reformed into something entirely different. These weren't mindless killers or simple predators operating on instinct alone. They were complex social creatures capable of loyalty, strategy, and apparently, gratitude. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Jack returned to the barn to check on his patient. The wolf was standing now, testing its injured leg carefully. When it saw Jack, it didn't retreat or show fear. Instead, it took 2 limping steps forward and did something that Jack would remember for the rest of his life. The great wolf lowered its head and gently pressed its muzzle against Jack's palm, holding there for a long moment before stepping back. Jack felt tears prick his eyes, something he hadn't experienced since his wife's funeral. He understood what was happening, what this gesture meant. It was acknowledgement, respect, a bridge built across the divide between species. "You're welcome," Jack whispered, his voice rough with emotion. That night, as darkness fell once again over the Wyoming wilderness, the wolves began to sing. It wasn't the mournful chorus of the previous night. This was different, triumphant, celebratory, a symphony of howls that spoke of something won rather than something lost. And in the barn, the old alpha lifted its head and added its voice to the song, a deep, resonant call that carried across the valley and brought tears to the eyes of everyone who heard it. The next morning brought complications that Jack hadn't anticipated. News of the wolf gathering had spread far beyond Wyoming's borders, and with it came an influx of people with competing agendas. Environmental activists arrived, setting up camps at the edge of Jack's property, celebrating what they saw as proof of nature's majesty and the success of conservation efforts. They carried signs reading "Wolves welcome" and "Protect our pack," treating the event as a vindication of their cause. But they weren't alone. Counter-protesters arrived 2 ranchers from across 3 states, some of whom had traveled hundreds of miles to voice their concerns. They saw the massive wolf gathering not as a heartwarming story of interspecies connection, but as evidence of a growing predator problem that threatened their livelihoods. Their signs read, "Protect our cattle" and "Ranchers' rights," and the tension between the 2 groups was palpable. Jack found himself in an impossible position, caught between 2 extremes. He was a rancher who lost livestock to wolves, who understood the economic realities his neighbors faced. But he was also the man who'd saved the alpha wolf, who'd witnessed firsthand the complexity and intelligence of these animals. He belonged to both worlds and fully to neither anymore. Federal wildlife officials arrived to take control of the situation, led by a senior biologist named Dr. Robert Kenmore, a man with 30 years of wolf research experience. Dr. Kenmore established a command center in Jack's dining room and began coordinating efforts to understand and ultimately resolve what he called an unprecedented biological event. "The wolves can't stay here indefinitely," Dr. Kenmore explained to Jack during a private conversation. "They need to return to their territories to hunt and maintain their packs. The longer they remain here, the greater the risk of conflict, starvation, or disease. We need to understand what's keeping them here and find a way to encourage them to disperse peacefully." Jack knew the answer was lying in his barn. As long as the alpha remained, the wolves would stay. The question was, what would happen when the alpha was strong enough to leave? Would the wolves simply depart, returning to their normal patterns? Or had something changed permanently in their behavior? Sarah Chun, the young ranger who'd been there from the beginning, had a different perspective. She'd been conducting detailed behavioral studies, documenting interaction patterns among the wolves. What she'd discovered was remarkable. "This isn't just about the alpha," she told Jack and Dr. Kenmore. "Look at how they're organizing themselves. The packs are maintaining distinct identities, but they're also cooperating in ways we've never documented. They're sharing hunting grounds, coordinating their movements, even sharing kills when they return from hunting trips. It's as if your act of compassion toward their alpha has created a temporary truce, a cessation of interpack rivalries." She pulled up videos on her laptop, showing footage captured over the past 48 hours. Wolves that normally would be territorial enemies were resting side by side. Packs that would compete viciously for resources were hunting cooperatively. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said, her voice filled with scientific excitement, "you may have accidentally demonstrated something profound about wolf behavior. You've shown that they are capable of setting aside territorial instincts in response to a greater shared value, in this case, respect for their alpha and perhaps recognition of your kindness. But not everyone saw it that way." Tom Fletcher, Jack's neighbor, had organized a meeting of local ranchers at the community center in the nearby town of Clearwater. Jack felt obligated to attend, knowing that his actions had become the center of an unwanted controversy. The meeting room was packed, the air thick with tension and the smell of coffee and anger. Tom stood at the front, his weather-beaten face grave. "We all know Jack Morrison is a good man. We've worked alongside him for decades, but what he's done has put all of us at risk. We've got 300 wolves concentrated in one area. That's 300 predators that aren't hunting their normal prey, that are getting desperate and hungry. What happens when they decide our cattle are easier targets than elk? What happens when one of our children is outside during the wrong moment?" The room erupted in agreements and concerns. Jack stood to speak, his voice cutting through the noise. "I understand your fears. I share them. I've lost cattle to wolves just like you have. But I'm asking you to see what I've seen. These animals aren't mindless killers. They're responding to something, showing a level of intelligence and emotional complexity that we've underestimated. Maybe instead of seeing this as a threat, we can see it as an opportunity to learn something, to find better ways of coexisting." "Coexisting?" An older rancher named Bill Hawkins stood up, his face red with anger. "Jack, wolves don't coexist. They kill. That's their nature. You've let sentiment cloud your judgment. That wolf in your barn would have killed your calves without a second thought if it had the chance." Jack felt his own anger rising. Maybe, or maybe we've never given them reason to be anything other than enemies. What if there's another way? The meeting dissolved into arguments that solved nothing. Jack left feeling isolated, caught between his ranching heritage and his newfound understanding. That night, lying in bed in his empty ranch house, he wondered what Margaret would have thought. She would have understood, he decided. She always saw the world as more complex, more nuanced than he'd been willing to acknowledge. Dawn of the fourth day brought a crisis. The wolves, which had been remarkably peaceful and organized, began showing signs of distress. Several had ventured beyond the ranch perimeter to hunt, but they weren't getting enough food. Dr. Kenmore reported that some of the wolves were beginning to show signs of starvation. "We need to resolve this situation soon," he told Jack. "Nature can't sustain this concentration of predators in one area. If we don't act, we'll start losing animals to hunger." Jack made a decision. He went to the barn, where the alpha wolf was now strong enough to stand and move around, though it still limped noticeably. "It's time," Jack said softly. "You need to go back to your life, and they need to go back to theirs. This can't continue." The wolf looked at him with those penetrating golden eyes, and Jack swore he saw understanding there. But when he opened the barn door, preparing to let the alpha walk out and hopefully lead the gathered wolves away, something entirely unexpected happened. The alpha wolf walked to the doorway, looked out at the assembled multitude, and then turned around and walked back to Jack. It sat down beside him, leaning its considerable weight against Jack's leg, and refused to move. "Stubborn old creature," Jack muttered, but he was smiling. The alpha wolf had made its choice. Whatever happened next, the wolf had decided that this ranch, this human, was where it wanted to be. And that's when the next phase of this extraordinary situation began. Dr. Kenmore called an emergency meeting that included Jack, Sarah Chun, Sheriff Hutchins, representatives from the Department of Wildlife, and several wolf behavior experts who'd arrived from universities across the country. The question facing them was unprecedented. What do you do when a wild apex predator chooses to stay with a human, and its action keeps 300 other wolves camped in an unsustainable situation? "We could tranquilize it and relocate it," suggested one of the federal officials, a bureaucrat named Harrison, who clearly wanted a quick administrative solution. Sarah Chun shook her head emphatically. "Absolutely not. This wolf has survived 17 years in the wild. It's earned its position and respect through a lifetime of challenges. Forcibly removing it would be cruel, possibly fatal given its injuries and age. And we have no idea how the other wolves would react. They could scatter peacefully, or we could trigger some kind of aggressive response." Dr. Kenmore leaned back in his chair, thinking, there might be another option. What if the wolf stays? The room fell silent. Jack was the first to speak. "You mean permanently? Live here on my ranch? Why not?" Dr. Kenmore warmed to his idea. "Mr. Morrison, you have 2,000 acres. That's more than enough territory to support a wolf, especially one that's no longer in its prime hunting years. You could provide supplemental food, maintain oversight of its health, and think about what we could learn. We've never had the opportunity to study an established wild alpha in a semi-domestic situation. The behavioral data alone would be invaluable. And what about the others?" Sheriff Hutchins asked, gesturing toward the window where hundreds of wolves were visible across the landscape. "That's the interesting part," Sarah interjected, pulling up data on her laptop. "I've been tracking their movements and behavior patterns. They're already starting to disperse naturally in small groups. They're making hunting forays that last longer each time. I think they're waiting for permission, in a sense. They're waiting for the alpha to signal that it's safe, that it's okay to return to their territories." Jack walked to the window, looking out at the sea of wolves. Could he do this? Could he share his ranch with a wild predator? It went against everything he'd been taught, everything he believed for 6 decades. But then he thought about the past 4 days, about what he'd witnessed and learned. He thought about Margaret and how she would have loved this, would have seen it as the adventure of a lifetime. "I'll do it," Jack said quietly. "I'll keep the alpha here if it wants to stay. God knows I've got plenty of room and plenty of elk meat in the freezer. But I want something in return." Dr. Kenmore leaned forward. "What's that?" "I want this to mean something. I want us to use this situation to figure out better ways for ranchers and wolves to coexist. I want research. I want education programs. I want solutions that don't require either the elimination of wolves or the destruction of ranching communities. If I'm going to be the crazy old man who lives with a wolf, then let's make sure some good comes from it. Over the next week, an extraordinary transformation took place. With Jack's permission to keep the alpha, and with careful observation from the assembled scientists, the gathered wolves began to disperse. But they didn't leave all at once or chaotically. Instead, they departed in an organized fashion, pack by pack, as if receiving individual audiences with their alpha. Jack and the researchers watched in amazement as different groups would approach the barn, wait for the alpha to emerge and exchange what could only be described as greeting rituals, and then turn and lope off, back toward their respective territories. Sarah documented everything, her research forming the foundation for what would become a groundbreaking paper on wolf superstructures and interpack communication. Each departure was different. Each carried its own subtle variations in body language and vocalization, suggesting a level of individualized communication that challenged existing understanding of wolf cognition. The alpha, which Jack had started calling Old Gray for lack of a better name, seemed content with the arrangement. Its leg was healing well, and while it would probably always carry a limp, the wolf was regaining strength daily. It had established a routine, spending nights in the barn where Jack had created a permanent space, and days roaming the ranch property, always staying within the fence lines as if it understood the boundaries of its new territory. Tom Fletcher came by on the 8th day, after the last of the wolves had departed. He found Jack in the barn, watching Old Gray rest in a patch of sunlight. Tom stood silent for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology, Jack. I was wrong about what you did. My oldest boy, he's been following all the news coverage, reading all the scientific articles. He explained to me what this could mean, how much we might learn. I let my fear do my thinking for me." Jack shook his head. "You weren't wrong to be afraid, Tom. Fear is reasonable. It's what keeps us alive. But maybe it's time we learn to be afraid of the right things. I'm more afraid of a world without wolves than a world with them. Took me 62 years to figure that out." The two men stood together, watching the old alpha wolf, and something in the valley shifted that day. It wasn't a complete transformation. There were still ranchers who opposed wolves, still activists who viewed ranching as inherently destructive. But Jack Morrison's ranch had become a symbol of possibility, a living demonstration that perhaps coexistence wasn't just a naive dream, but an achievable reality. News organizations from around the world had covered the story. Jack found himself giving interviews, explaining his perspective with a mixture of gruff practicality and unexpected poetry. A video of him talking to Old Gray, explaining ranch life to the attentive wolf, went viral with over 50 million views. People responded to the authenticity, to the sight of a weathered cowboy and an ancient wolf forming an impossible friendship. Dr. Kenmore established a research station on a corner of Jack's property with the rancher's permission. Graduate students began arriving to conduct long-term studies of Old Gray as behavior and to monitor how the dispersed wolves adapted to having one of their alphas in what was essentially semi-domesticity. The data they collected would influence wildlife management policies for decades to come. But perhaps the most significant change was happening in the local community. Inspired by Jack's example and frustrated by decades of conflict, a group of ranchers and conservationists formed the Clearwater Coexistence Council. They began developing innovative solutions, modified ranching practices that reduce livestock vulnerability, compensation programs for lost animals, educational initiatives that help both sides understand each other's perspectives and concerns. Jack found himself at the center of this movement, though he insisted he was just a rancher who made one decent choice on a cold winter night. But others saw him as something more, a bridge between worlds, proof that change was possible, even in places where traditions ran deep and stubbornness was considered a virtue. As winter gave way to early spring, Old Gray's presence on the ranch became normal, almost routine. The wolf followed Jack during his rounds, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly enjoying the companionship. Jack talked to the animal constantly, sharing his thoughts about weather and cattle and the changing world. He knew Old Gray didn't understand his words, but he suspected the wolf understood the intent, the companionship behind them. And then, on a morning in late March, something extraordinary happened that would bring the story full circle. Jack woke before dawn to an unusual sound, not threatening, but different from the normal ranch morning chorus. He dressed quickly and stepped outside to find his property once again surrounded by wolves. But this gathering was different from the first. There were perhaps 50 animals this time, not 300, and their demeanor was entirely changed. They weren't sitting in vigil or defensive postures. Instead, they moved with excited energy, young wolves playing and adults mingling in ways that suggested celebration rather than crisis. Old Gray stood at the barn entrance, and even from a distance, Jack could see the change in the wolf's posture. There was pride there, excitement, an energy that the aging predator hadn't shown since its arrival 4 months earlier. The alpha looked at Jack and then deliberately turned and limped toward the gathered wolves. Jack followed, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The wolves parted as Old Gray approached, creating a corridor that led to the center of the gathering. And there, protected by a circle of what Jack assumed were pack members, was a young female wolf with 3 tiny pups nursing at her side. Understanding dawned on Jack with breathtaking clarity. Old Gray had called them here. These were the alpha's descendants, a daughter or granddaughter who'd recently given birth. And she brought the pups to meet the old patriarch, to introduce the newest generation to the wolf who'd shaped our bloodline. Sarah Chun, who'd become a regular visitor to the ranch and had set up motion sensor cameras throughout the property, arrived within an hour of Jack's call. She watched the gathering with tears in her eyes. "This is unprecedented," she whispered. "Cross-pack visitation to introduce offspring to a super alpha? Jack, this has never been documented. They're showing him the future of their line. They're honoring him." Throughout the morning, different groups arrived and departed, each bringing young wolves to meet Old Gray. Some of the pups were bold, approaching the old alpha with clumsy curiosity. Others were shy, hiding behind their mothers until Old Gray's gentle demeanor coaxed them forward. Each time, the aging wolf would lower its great head and touch noses with the youngsters, a gesture of acceptance and blessing that Jack found profoundly moving. Dr. Kimmore arrived by afternoon with a film crew from a nature documentary series that had been following the story. They captured footage that would eventually win awards, the old alpha wolf surrounded by the next generation, a living testament to survival and adaptation. Old Gray moved among them with obvious pride despite the pronounced limp, the injuries that would never fully heal. The wolf had survived fights, starvation, human encroachment, and the countless dangers of wild existence. And now, in what should have been the twilight of its life, it had found something unexpected: sanctuary, partnership, and a chance to see its legacy secured. By evening, the visiting wolves had departed, melting back into the forest from which they'd come. Old Gray stood with Jack at the fence line, watching them go. The wolf leaned against Jack's leg in the gesture that had become familiar between them, and Jack rested his hand on the animal's thick fur. "You did good, old friend," Jack said softly. "Built yourself quite a family out there. Must be 100 wolves in these mountains carrying your blood. That's immortality of a sort, isn't it?" The weeks that followed brought a different kind of routine. Old Gray's energy began to wane as spring deepened into early summer. The wolf spent more time resting, less time patrolling the property. Jack noticed the change and understood what it meant. 17 years was ancient for a wild wolf, and the injuries from that final fight combined with age were taking their inevitable toll. Jack moved a cot into the barn and began sleeping there, wanting to be present for whatever time Old Gray had left. They passed the nights together, the old rancher and the old wolf, two survivors from different worlds who'd found unexpected companionship in the twilight of their lives. Sarah visited frequently, monitoring Old Gray's condition but respecting the bond that had formed. "You know," she told Jack one evening, "what you've done here has changed wildlife management policy in 4 states. The Clearwater Coexistence Council model is being studied nationally. Livestock losses to wolves in this valley are down 60% because ranchers are implementing better protection measures, and wolf populations are stable because they're not being persecuted like before." One act of kindness rippled outward in ways you couldn't have imagined. Jack nodded but kept his focus on Old Gray. "I just saved a dying animal. Didn't set out to change the world. That's how change usually happens," Sarah replied. "One small decision, one moment of choosing compassion over convenience. The world changes because individuals decide to be better than they have to be." On a warm night in June, with stars brilliant overhead and the scent of pine carrying on the breeze, Old Gray's breathing changed. Jack, who'd been dozing on his cot, came immediately alert. He moved to the wolf's side, kneeling in the hay, and placed his hand on the animal's side. Old Gray's eyes opened, those golden eyes that had first looked at Jack with resignation and death in their depths 6 months earlier. But there was no fear there now, no pain. Just peace and something that looked remarkably like contentment. The wolf's breathing slowed, became shallower, and Jack felt tears streaming down his weathered face. "It's okay," he whispered. "You can rest now. You've earned it. Your family is strong. Your legacy is secure. You did everything a wolf could do and more." Old Gray took one more breath, let it out slowly, and was gone. Jack sat with the body until dawn, one hand resting on the still warm fur, saying goodbye to a creature that had taught him more in 6 months than he'd de-learned in the previous 62 years. When morning came, Jack called Sarah. Together, they decided that Old Gray should be buried on the high ridge overlooking the ranch, a place where the wolf had often stood during its time there, surveying the territory it had claimed as its final home. Jack dug the grave himself, refusing offers of help, needing the physical labor to process his grief. Word spread quickly through the valley and beyond. By the time Jack and Sarah carried Old Gray's body to the ridge that afternoon, they weren't alone. Tom Fletcher was there, and the Hartley family. Jim Dawson had come, and dozens of other ranchers who'd watched Jack's journey from skepticism to understanding. Dr. Kenmore stood beside his graduate students. Even some of the environmental activists who decamped on Jack's property months earlier had returned to pay their respects. But the most remarkable attendance came from the forest. As Jack lowered Old Gray's body into the earth, wolves began to appear on the surrounding ridges. Not 300 this time, but enough 30, maybe 40 animals, sitting silent witness to the burial of their alpha. They'd come to say goodbye, to honor the wolf who'd shaped their lives and territories. Jack stood at the edge of the grave, searching for words. He'd never been good at speeches, had never been comfortable with sentiment or public displays of emotion. But something about this moment demanded acknowledgement. "I spent my whole life thinking I understood this land and everything on it," Jack began, his voice rough but clear. "Thought I knew the difference between what belonged and what didn't, between friend and enemy, between what mattered and what was just in the way. This old wolf taught me I was wrong about almost everything." He looked out at the gathered people and the watching wolves. "Old Gray showed me that the world is more complicated, more beautiful, and more full of possibility than I ever imagined. Showed me that kindness isn't weakness, that understanding isn't surrender, and that sometimes the enemies we fear are only enemies because we never tried to see them differently." Jack knelt and placed his hand on the earth beside the grave. This ranch has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather homesteaded this land, fought to tame it, to make it productive. My grandfather and father continued that fight, and I thought my job was to do the same, to fight against the wilderness, to conquer it, to bend it to human will. He stood slowly, looking at Old Gray's body. But maybe that was never the right fight. Maybe the real challenge is learning to live with the wilderness, to find our place within it rather than above it. Old Gray taught me that lesson, and I'm grateful. They covered the grave as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too vivid to be real. As darkness fell, the wolves on the ridges began to howl, not the mournful death song they'd sung when Old Gray was dying, but something different. It sounded to Jack's ears like farewell and gratitude mixed together, an acknowledgement of a life well lived and a bridge well built between their world and his. In the months that followed, Jack's ranch became a different kind of monument. The research station that Dr. Kenmore had established expanded, becoming a center for studying human-wildlife coexistence. Students and scientists from around the world came to learn from the Clearwater Coexistence Council's model. The story of Jack and Old Gray was taught in schools, written about in scientific journals, featured in documentaries and books. Jack gave talks occasionally, though he never felt entirely comfortable in that role. He preferred the quiet work of his ranch, the daily routines that had structured his life. But he understood that his story mattered to people, that it represented hope in a world where such hope was increasingly rare. On the anniversary of the day he'd found Old Gray dying in the snow, Jack made his way up to the grave on the ridge. Fresh flowers sat there. Someone else had made the pilgrimage before him. He stood in the cold January wind, looking out over his property and the wilderness beyond, and felt Old Gray's presence as clearly as if the wolf stood beside him. "You're still teaching me, aren't you?" Jack said to the wind. "Still showing me new ways of seeing." Movement caught his eye. A young wolf, probably one of Old Gray's great-grandchildren, stood at the tree line watching him. It held his gaze for a long moment, unafraid, before turning and disappearing into the forest. Jack smiled. The legacy continued, the bridge held firm, and the impossible friendship between a cowboy and a wolf had changed the world in small but significant ways. As Jack walked back down to his ranch house, he passed the barn where Old Gray had spent those final months. He paused in the doorway, remembering the night he'd brought the dying wolf home, remembering his uncertainty and fear. He'd been so certain he knew how the world worked, so confident in his understanding of what mattered and what didn't. "Thank you," Jack said to the empty barn, "to the memory of golden eyes and ancient wisdom. Thank you for showing me I was wrong. Thank you for the gift of changing my mind." The barn door creaked in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not in mourning or celebration, but simply as an acknowledgement of existence, a declaration that life continued in all its complex, beautiful, impossible forms. Jack listened until the sound faded, then continued toward his house, toward warmth and rest, carrying with him the lessons learned from a dying wolf and the 300 that had come to stand guard at dawn. The story of the cowboy and the wolf would be told and retold, growing in the telling, becoming legend. But for Jack Morrison, it would always be simpler than that. It was the story of one cold night, one choice to show mercy instead of walking away, one bridge built between worlds that had been at war for too long. And it was the story of discovering, in the twilight of his life, that understanding and compassion could change everything. Not just for him, but for an entire valley, an entire way of thinking about humanity's place in the natural world. As Jack settled into his chair that night, with a cup of coffee warming his hands, he looked at the photograph Sarah had given him. Old Gray standing in the morning sunlight, proud and strong, despite age and injury, looking directly at the camera with those penetrating golden eyes. Jack raised his cup in a silent toast. Here's to you, old friend. Here's to new beginnings and bridges built. Here's to the courage to change our minds and the wisdom to recognize teachers in unexpected places. Rest well. Your work here is done, and it was done better than anyone could have hoped. Outside, the Wyoming night was cold and clear, full of stars and possibilities. And in the forest surrounding Jack Morrison's ranch, wolves moved through their territories, hunting and playing and raising their young, carrying within them the genetic legacy of an ancient alpha, who taught a stubborn cowboy that the world was wider, stranger, and more beautiful than he'd ever allowed himself to believe.